All right, everybody. I hope you're all doing well and keeping your heads up. I've got another little lecture video for you here to wrap up chapter 5 on existentialism and authenticity and ethics. So far, we've covered Nietzsche, Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, and lastly here, we're going to look at a little bit at Simone de Beauvoir, who shares a lot in common with Sartre. She actually she's a contemporary of Sartre and influenced him in many ways, especially in his later work. One of the big differences between at least early Sartre that we saw in Simone de Beauvoir is that Simone de Beauvoir emphasizes the social aspect of human existence in a way that Sartre, at least the early Sartre, did not. And so while we're looking at these few ideas from Simone de Beauvoir and her idea of the ethics of ambiguity, we ought to keep in mind some stuff that we've already covered. So again, we're looking at alternative approaches to philosophical ethics. In many ways, they're alternative views because they depart from the tasks of and some of the underlying assumptions of mainstream moral theory that we've looked at up until this point. Once again, in Beauvoir, we're not going to get a decision procedure for making correct moral decisions. So again, that's one of the ways in which many philosophers might think, well, she's not really doing moral theory anymore. And in the existentialists, reason doesn't seem to play as primary a role. Passion often does that, and that's somewhat of the case here with Simone de Beauvoir as well. As we work through a few of these passages from de Beauvoir, we ought to keep in mind some stuff that we've already seen from Sartre. So just as a reminder here, keep in mind that Sartre called the first principle of existentialism in his essay, Existentialism as a Humanism, this idea that existence precedes essence, that we define ourselves after we come to after recognizing that we are existing in the world. That's the opposite of the way that the Western philosophical tradition has approached most of it's the opposite way. Let me kind of back up there. It's the opposite of somebody like Plato, Descartes, Kant, who thought that there are these essences of human nature or God, and then after that, the task of ethics is to comport ourselves in accordance with that nature, that essence. We don't have that in the existentialist, and we'll see that is especially true with Simone de Beauvoir here. We had that notion of being condemned to be free, that's a part of our human condition, is that we didn't get a choice about whether we get to make choices or not, right? So it's a part of our condition. And we had that notion of bad faith, trying to escape our freedom and our radical freedom and our radical responsibility for what we value. That notion of bad faith, right? Lying to oneself, specifically about our radical freedom, treating oneself more like an object, right? And then of course the idea of the look, and objectification. So we saw that in at least early Sartre, hell is other people. I recognize myself through the lens that other people see me and treat myself like an object. That notion will also play an important role in Simone de Beauvoir's thinking. So let's, with those things in mind, let's turn to think about her a little bit. One of the first things to point out about Simone de Beauvoir here is that she's an existentialist, but also a feminist thinker. She's a part of what's typically called the second wave of feminism. So oftentimes you'll hear people refer to the three waves of feminism. So in the first wave, you kind of had like utilitarian, Harriet Taylor, Wollstonecraft, these sorts of thinkers who were primarily aimed at like what women's suffrage, like getting equal voting rights or the right to own property or something like that. And so that's the kind of issues that they were focused on. In second wave feminism, the second wave feminists typically focused on the social more than just the political or legal realm. And then third wave feminism is kind of much more diverse and looks at some of the criticism and kind of criticizes certain aspects of second wave feminism and goes from there. And so it's an oversimplification, obviously, of those three waves, but just trying to situate Simone de Beauvoir here in that context. And so there's this famous line from Beauvoir will look both at some passages out of The Second Sex and some passages out of her book, The Ethics of Ambiguity. I have them in reverse order here. The Ethics of Ambiguity was actually published first, I believe, in like 47, and then The Second Sex came after that. But she has this famous line, one is not born a woman, but rather becomes a woman. So there's that idea of existence preceding essence, right? So it's a famous line. We'll want to try to make a little bit of sense out of that kind of slogan there. And so the first thing to note then is, since she is a feminist thinker, she's worried about, and here's a way in which she's already focused on the social situation or the social context of human existence and the individual's existence in a way that the early Sartre was not, is that she's already thinking in terms of social relations with one another. For Sartre, again, the early Sartre, it's like we have this radical freedom over what we choose to value, and he seemed to almost ignore the fact that we have to deal with other people, right? Except that other people become hell for us, right? Well, she has a less negative appraisement of that social condition there. Let me get rid of my cat here. He's say hi to everybody, Sazarek. There you go. Always trying to get in the window over here next to me. So all right, we get this notion of woman as other. And the notion of the other plays an important role and is a significant idea or category in a lot of contemporary European philosophy. Simone Beauvoir is a French thinker. We've already seen it play a role in Sartre's thinking. We'll see it play a very important role in Levinas's thinking in the next chapter as well. It's a concept that's used differently, but what it basically means, right? So different thinkers have different takes on the other, right? But what it often means is like this idea of something foreign to myself, something that is radically other than me, my own ego, right? Or my own consciousness, right? And so here she's thinking of woman as being defined as the other to man in typical societies, right? Actual existing societies up until this point in time, right? So she says, man is defined as a human being, and a woman as female. Whenever she behaves as a human being, she is said to imitate the male. And so this is a common theme in lots of feminist thought, is that what the default position for being a human being is associated with male traits or the male sex or the male gender, right? And so woman is defined as the other to men. So if men are what count as human beings, right? Oftentimes we have this notion when we read older texts that they're using the word man, right? And sometimes that looks non-problematic, doesn't look so problematic. Other times it looks like what they're doing is really thinking of human beings as man, right? So that's what's going on here. Man is defined as a human being and woman as female. So woman is defined as the other of the human being, right? So that's already giving them a secondary inferior status. And so when she behaves more fully human, she's imitating the male in some way, right? So this humanity is male, and man defines woman not as herself, but as relative to him. She is not regarded as an autonomous being, right? So the idea then is that women are subordinate, or treated as man's other in society. This is what makes for a patriarchal society, is that that there's this recognition of some kind of difference between the sexes or the genders, and then that difference is used as a way of subordinating, or as the basis for arguments or practices, subordinating women to men and subordinating their lives to men. So she says, as I mentioned earlier, one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. So there's this notion of existence preceding essence. And Simone de Beauvoir rejects this idea, kind of notion of a biological essentialist account of social relationships, right? So woman here is more like a social role, right? Rather than just a matter of our parts, our biological parts. So this notion that one becomes a woman, right, it means that there's no predefined essence of a woman, and that it's something that has to be created, right? Both passively and actively through relationships with others. And so again, remember that first principle of existentialism mentioned by Sartre there, and how that illustrates how that's coming across here with regard to gender and sex in Simone de Beauvoir. And then another key thing to point out here is that some scholars think that this slogan in The Second Sex is signaling what's become commonplace in much of the thinking about gender and sex, is the sex-gender distinctions, where sex refers to our reproductive systems, our biological parts, and secondary sexual traits, right? And gender is about a social role, right? So there looks like there's a distinction there. Sometimes the way we think of a sex has to do with more with behaviors, right, than it does parts, right? And so this idea that you're not born a woman, because it's being woman is not exhausted by just your reproductive parts or that sex identification, that biological identification. It's a matter of the roles that we perform in society. And so that looks like that kind of distinction there then, that she's saying that it's not that you're just born a woman, there's more to being a woman than just your reproductive systems, right, or your secondary biological traits. It has to do with the roles that you have in society and that are allotted to you in society. So she says to show your true ability, right, in a sense, to surpass the limits of your ability, to go a little beyond them, to dare, to seek, to invent, it is as such a moment that new talents are revealed, discovered, and realized, right? So if we're living in a patriarchal system where women are relegated to particular social roles, they're not free. Remember the role that freedom plays in existentialist thoughts, very important. We're being restricted, right? So to become a woman, in her sense, would not mean to just fit into the social roles that women are allotted in a patriarchal system where they're subjugated to men, right? So what would that mean to emancipate women then? To emancipate woman is to refuse to confine her to the relations she bears to man, right? So in other words, to become a woman in the liberatory sense is not to just become those roles that are allotted to women in a patriarchal and oppressive society, right? It means to go beyond those. In other words, woman has to define herself, and to do so without reference to man as man's other, in other words, right? So to emancipate woman is to refuse to confine her to the relationship she bears to man, not to deny them to her. Let her have her independent existence, and she will continue nonetheless to exist for him also, mutually recognizing each other as subject. Each will yet remain for the other and other, right? So we're going to have sexual difference still, and gender difference still. The reciprocity of their relations will not do away with the miracles, desire, possession, love, dream, adventure, worked by the division of human beings into two separate categories. And the words that move us, giving, conquering, uniting, will not lose their meaning. On the contrary, when we abolish the slavery of half of humanity together with a whole system of hypocrisy that it implies, then the division of humanity will reveal its genuine significance, and the human couple will find its true form. Right? So this notion is that society has defined woman as man's other, and therefore subordinate, right? And then so liberatory social relationships would allow for mutual recognition of each other as subject. Woman, defined as man's other, is an object to man, right? And so internalizing that kind of objectification, right, it just would become a form of like self-subjugation for women. Oh, I'm giving you a little example. One time I had a student, a female student, and she was actually a biology major and wanted to go become a doctor. But when it came time to studying all this feminist stuff in class, she came to me to office hours and she was like, well, look, women are just not good at these sorts of things. Like she listed off, mathematics and science, even though she was a biology major, because she wanted to become a doctor. And so at one and the same time, this young student was both trying to go beyond her own internalized social roles, right? Those patriarchal social roles that had defined her in a particular way. But at the same time, so she's saying things like, women aren't good at these things, right? And on the other hand, she's pursuing a degree to go become more than what has been allotted to her in a patriarchal society. So here we get this idea of equality then, right? But equality doesn't mean sameness for Simone de Beauvoir. So what she's doing in The Second Sex is arguing against an either or way of framing questions of sex and gender. What do I mean by that? She's rejecting this idea that either men and women are equal, right, the same, or they are different, right? So the binary there. What she's doing is arguing for equality between the sexes and genders, while also emphasizing and not trying to erase sexual difference, that there are phenomenologically speaking differences between the sexes. So, but Beauvoir is arguing against using sexual difference, right, as a basis for legitimizing any kind of oppressive social relationships. So again, moving beyond just this political sphere, where we're talking about property rights or voting rights or inheriting money, this sort of thing, right? And moving into social arenas where women are allowed other opportunities. And she emphasized economic relationships. She was influenced by Marx. She wanted to, women to be more independent in the economic sphere as well. And so she's arguing against using sexual difference as a basis for legitimizing any kind of oppressive political and social systems. And that's what patriarchy is in her view, right? So equality for her is not sameness. It's equality is the mutual recognition of each other, men and women, as both subjects rather than as men as subjects and agents and women as objects, which is how it's done under patriarchy. All right, so there's a little bit on the second sex and woman as other, right? So there, we'll see this notion in the next chapter where the textbook talks about negative othering. So negative othering is this idea of treating the other as being hostile towards the other, maybe to the point of exterminating the other, right? Stripping them away of their rights or humanity. And in Simone de Beauvoir, we have a negative othering where woman is treated as other and therefore subordinate. So there's a kind of negative othering going on there too. And so with that in the backdrop, then let's take a look at what she has to say about ethics. And this comes from a book called The Ethics of Ambiguity. And ambiguity describes the human condition according to Simone de Beauvoir. So if we remember Sartre, he eschewed talking about human nature and wanted to talk about the human condition in certain historical time periods. Certain epochs is the word that he used, right? And so again, I pulled out a few lines from this from her book to emphasize this idea of ambiguity and her notion of freedom. And so what would freedom look like for Simone de Beauvoir? And we can think about freedom between the sexes there. So one of the things that the patriarchal system does is that it limits the freedom of women by treating them like objects, right? So as long as there have been men and they have lived, they have all felt this tragic ambiguity of their condition. But as long as there have been philosophers, they have thought, most of them have tried to mask the ambiguity of our condition, right? So what is the ambiguity of our condition? Well, it's that we desire certain things, we desire certainty, we have certain values, but the world frustrates us from realizing or bringing about those values, for instantiating them, right? That's the ambiguity of our position, right? We have these desires, but we often fail to realize them. And our condition, we don't have certainty about our decisions at all. We're left to choose, often without a guide. So again, a theme coming from existentialism as a humanism from Sartre. And so she says, let us try to assume our fundamental ambiguity. In other words, don't try to mask the ambiguity by positing false notions of certainty or absolute value, right? So she says, let us try to assume our fundamental ambiguity. It is in the knowledge of the genuine conditions of our life that we must draw our strength and live, and our reason and get our reason for acting. As for us, whatever the case may be, we live in freedom. It is true that this belief must lead us to despair. We must grant this curious paradox that from the moment a man recognizes himself as free, he is prohibited from wishing for anything. So again, we have this notion of being condemned to be free, right? We are radically free agents, at least with respect to what we choose to value, right? But we're left to make those choices without any kind of certainty with regard to what's going to work out or what's going to work or what's not going to work, right? So again, would that lead to despair? I'm radically free. I have to make choices. I don't have any certainty or any guides about how to make those choices. So a big existentialist theme there, and we saw this back in Existentialism as Humanism as well, is that we try to escape that freedom. Bad faith, right? So she says, on the contrary, it appears to us that by turning towards this freedom, that we are going to discover a principle of action whose range will be universal. The characteristic feature of all ethics is to consider human life as a game that can be won or lost, and to teach man the means of winning. Now we have seen that the original scheme of man is ambiguous. He wants to be, to the extent that he coincides with his wish, he fails, right? I'm free, I make plans about what to do, but I have trouble realizing those in the world, right? So all the plans in which this will to be actualized are condemned. The ends of circumscribed by these plans remain mirages. Human transcendence, going beyond, right, is vainly engulfed in those miscarried attempts, but man also wills himself to be a disclosure of being, and if he coincides with this wish, he wins, for the fact that the world becomes persistent by his presence in it, becomes present by his presence in it. So a principle of action that will be universal. Here again, we see a bit of a worry about existentialist ethics. On the one hand, they're positing this idea that we're radically free. Ethics seems to presuppose some universal criteria for right and wrong. How is it that existentialists are justifying that when they've rejected any kind of stable human nature or universal reason like we found in other moral theories? So she says, every man is originally free. We're going to have kind of two conceptions of freedom at work in the ethics of ambiguity here, in the sense that he has spontaneously cast himself into the world. Let's call that ontological freedom. But if we consider this spontaneity in its facticity, facticity is the idea of the material conditions of our existence, right? So it appears to us only as a pure contingency, and upsurging as stupidity as the Klineman, the unpredictable behavior of atoms, which turned up at any moment whatsoever from any direction whatsoever. And it was quite necessary for the atom to arrive somewhere, but its movement was not justified by this result, which had not been chosen. It remained absurd. Thus, human spontaneity always projects itself towards something. So this is, again, the freedom of my open-ended existence. I'm looking into the future, being for itself in Sartre's language. So this human spontaneity always projects itself towards something. The psychoanalyst discovers a meaning even in abortive acts and attacks of hysteria, but in order for this meaning to justify the transcendence which discloses it, it must itself be founded, which will never be if I do not choose to found it myself. So the project of orientation is still in oneself here, rather than, like we'll see in the next chapter, where ethics is about a encounter with the other. Here it's about how you're going to make yourself again, how you're going to transform yourself, how you're going to create yourself. Right? So now I have made this choice. We have said that it would be contrary deliberately to will oneself not free, but one can choose not to will himself free. In laziness, headlessness, capriciousness, cowardice, impatience, one can test the meaning of the project at the very moment that one defines it. So again, we have the notion of bad faith here, trying to escape my own freedom, lie to myself about my radical freedom and radical responsibility for my choices. So again, this looks like an aspect of our condition as human beings is that we are radically free in many respects to choose what we're going to value. So it's, again, the ontological condition of freedom, or ontological freedom, and then the value choices we make are the ethical, right, in quote marks here, and existential freedom. What is it that I'm going to choose to value? And again, we have this notion in Simone de Beauvoir and Sartre that making a value choice is making a choice about what's valuable, not only for myself, but it also provides an image to others of what is valuable. And so she says, a freedom which is interested only in denying freedom must be denied. And it is not true that the recognition of the freedom of others limits my own freedom. To be free is not to have a power to do anything you like. It is to be able to surpass the given towards an open future. The existence of others as freedom defines my situation and is even the condition of my own freedom. If I am oppressed, I am thrown into a prison, but not if I am kept from throwing my neighbor into a prison. So the idea here is that we have mutual freedom as subjects. Again, we see that notion of the idea of equality between the sexes, treating each other as subjects rather than as me being a subject because I'm a man and others being an object for me and defined relative to me because they are not men, because they are women. So this idea is that there we have then a kind of existential freedom, right? So her idea is that, and we saw this previously, right? To go beyond is to enhance one's freedom, to go beyond the limits of the strictures of the society that has placed you through social roles. Genuine freedom is to move beyond those, to create oneself beyond those limits. So that's what she's saying here. And it is not true that the recognition of freedom limits my own freedom. To be free is not to have the power to do anything you like, is to be able to surpass the given. So we show up in the world and there are givens. Society's already structured in certain ways for us, right? When we show up on the scene and we're thrown into existence. Freedom then is to go beyond and create oneself beyond the strictures of those, right? Where those limits are placed on, those are based on social roles, they're really involved in objectification of others, right? So again, we get two types of freedom here: the capacity for our radical freedom, our choosing, and then the mutual realization of values that preserve that freedom, right? That's what ethical values amount to for, ethically correct values amount to for the existentialist here. That means we need to choose values that preserve our ontological freedom and that involve recognizing each other as subjects engaged in projects of self-creation through social relationships. So there's, again, a key difference between the Simone de Beauvoir's basic approach to existentialism and the early Sartre, which typically ignored the social dimension of existence and seemed to cast others as always hell, as always objectifying. And so with that, we kind of come to the end of the existentialist section here. And so let's take a look at a few criticisms of existentialist ethics. And we see this common refrain in this chapter with all of the folks in it, all the thinkers in it that emphasize the idea that ethics is primarily a matter of self-creation, right? That the worry is that is promoting an unacceptable, maybe a morally unacceptable radical individualism that ignores our social existence. That's kind of a key problem with Nietzsche and with Sartre, especially the early Sartre, less so Simone de Beauvoir. And then again, we have this additional problem that rejecting the traditional basis for objective and universal morality, some account of human nature, that undermines the possibility of offering a logically coherent alternative approach to ethics. So again, what is it that justifies why is it that if I make a value choice, that I'm making a choice for someone other than myself, as Sartre says, that I'm providing a model for others? What's the basis for that? So there's the problem. And then one last little problem to worry about is that if we're taking this existential approach to ethics, where what matters is being an authentic individual and creating myself, recognizing my freedom rather than denying it, and embracing that freedom and taking responsibility for all of my value choices and what I am valuing, what is the basis for restrictions on how I treat others? So in all of our previous moral theories, realizing that unique human nature, and Aristotle put strictures on what I would do to myself and others. In Hobbes, I'm supposed to accept constraints on my action and pursuing my own preferences based on what's in my own self-interest. In utilitarianism, it's the harm principle that provides a justification for limiting my liberty. And in deontology, it's the categorical imperative. I have to refrain from treating others as mere means. But what is it in existentialism that provides a justification for putting constraints on my individual liberty, my projects of self-creation? It leaves that kind of more open-ended and therefore more problematic with those thinkers. And so there's a little bit on existentialism.